you very much. Hopefully Jim's going to stay for a few more questions. I'd like to change the... I'd like to change the subject just for a minute, but one thing that's very clear, you have a passionate chairman here, and if you're a CEO and you go to the board and Jim's the chairman, you better have your act together and your facts straight, because you're going to get challenged. And so that creates a different culture, a different way that the board will operate in that company compared to some of the other companies that some of us have seen. And so with that introduction, I'd like to ask Mike Vernon to just say a few words about how he approaches the culture in companies at the podium here. I'm not sure if you have a slide or two, Mike, but if you can come up here to the podium, then Mike will say a few words about himself and then talk a bit about how he approaches company culture, and then we'll have a few questions.
Hi everybody, my name's Mike. Well, the first thing is I'd approach Jim having thoroughly prepared and rehearsed my arguments, including understanding the maths and the geology of what I was actually talking about, because I think I'd be in for a very good debate. So I treat you actually personally as an opportunity to learn how to be better to come back at you next time. My history is somewhat scattered. I carry my interests across a number of aspects of science. One, I'm an electronics engineer, so deeply rooted in Fourier analysis, Bessel functions, Bayesian statistics, etc. And second, I'm an industrial sociologist, and I come at industrial sociology from the point of view of business as a social systems. Now, how did I get into that? Well, I did a lot of work in aviation and automotive, and also in British American tobacco, looking at sort of global reach. I don't smoke personally, so I don't know what your addictions are, but I certainly found their addiction to the cash flows that arose out of the crops over the various parts of the world. The point was that each one of those sectors was at a stage of evolution, and as I sat and listened to the inputs this morning, I was very, very much reminded of where are you in the evolution of the story of your particular sector? Where is it your industry is heading to? Where have you come from? Who were the founders? What are the cultural inheritances that you have had? Because there's been quite a bit of comment on overshooting, overspending, misdecision making, so on and so forth. I don't see that as a particular difficulty. I say, myself, that it suggests that you are at a particular point of evolution in the story of this industry. One thing I know is, when I was in aviation, particularly on the sort of off-wing maintenance for Rolls-Royce, the aftermarket there, I dealt with some very, very, very smart people. Technically, they outreached my ability to understand even the maths that I'm capable of. But the one thing that I did know was that they lacked one single capability, and that was to bring their knowledge directly into the service of each other in a way that made a better and more valuable contribution to the business issue that they were there to deal with. In other words, although they'd spent several years developing their intellectual skills and the knowledge that attaches to that, they had failed, or at least the institutions where they studied, INSEAD, London Business School, Harvard, etc., they had failed to be taught how to bring that knowledge into the service not just of their colleagues, but of the business process that properly expressed the strategic objectives of their company. Now, when we took a look at this, I was very privileged, I think, to have conversations with people who, A, are a lot smarter, and I don't know about you, but I found myself, sort of dreaming about, well, what kind of guy am I at some point? And the one thing I discovered about myself was that I'm gifted with an abundance of stupidity. What it means is I can ask really amazing questions, and I really don't know the answer to the question. What I discovered was that the smart asses around me asked the questions because they already knew the answers. So all I had to do was to use my naive gear, and I would get properly educated by all the people around me. So I turned this to advantage when I got into the major projects that I got involved in, and started to get the people who were in the room to train me, to educate me, to be smarter and better, not because I was inherently, but because they were, and I could learn from them. So I not only learned how to bring my expertise into the service of my colleagues, but I also began to learn how to leverage my own ignorance or limitations to draw their expertise into my service as well. Brought me to a place which is to do with risk. Do I? Ah, right. I mean, come on, risk. It's a four-letter word, right? How many of you have been trained in risk management? Oh, okay, maybe it isn't a four-letter word. Oh, right, okay. How many of you have been trained to use risk events in order to drive performance improvement, which was one of the points that Raj was making in his thing? Brian? Yeah, yeah. What we learned was if we had risk events in the procedures that we were following, what we could do is to look for root cause. What we looked for was where the risk event occurred, we saw it not as a place where somebody was to blame, but as a place which was a symptom of a process failure. So when we undertook the root cause, we burrowed into the process and tracked, how many of you are familiar with the phrase shift left? Good. Shift to the lowest cost point of influencing the whole process. And what we did was we took statements like this. I think, which way does this go? Yeah. And stuff like this. Examples of specific risks. Unclear deliverables, inexperienced project teams, poor supplier assessment. Each one of you in your different ways will have experienced these things and learned how to do something with it. What we discovered was each one of those events was a consequence of a process which began somewhere other than where the event occurred. So when we started looking at the issues of risk, and we dealt with the safety risks, the reputational risks, the financial risks, the other types of risks that are involved, we came to then look, particularly in aviation and automotive where they're very fond of their ISOs, an undesirable situation or circumstance that has both a likelihood of occurring and a potentially negative consequence. Okay, right, how does that help me? Well, I had the good fortune some years ago to fall in with a guy called Chris Agiris from Harvard. He said he would mentor me for a few years. I don't know if any of you have been mentored, but I call him my tormentor rather than my mentor. And he probed very strongly into the reasoning that I used in the way in which I approached particular problems. Now, those of you who, like me, have had successful line careers, you're not used to having your judgment challenged, I don't think. And the challenge can be experienced not as helpful feedback, but possibly as criticism. With Chris, I had to learn that actually the feedback that he was giving me was designed to help me improve the way I contributed to the results that we were jointly engaged to achieve. And he also introduced me to the work of a chap called Jay Forrester, MIT. Now, I don't know if any of you have gotten into system dynamics, but I strongly advise you, if you haven't, to take a read. It's really, really interesting. We used it a lot in aviation and automotive to start to plan how to implement, taking into account variables, including a thing we call decision delay, which in automotive particularly caused most of the ricochets we were finding when we tried to lean out the procedures. Most misbehavior of corporate social and governance systems arises from a dependence on erroneous intuitive solutions to complex problems. As we heard this morning, I think it was from Mark, System 1 and System 2, the fast, intuitive, instinctive system that launches a memory before you've properly understood the problem that you're trying to address. System 2, you use that launch of that memory, that reaction in you as a trigger to slow down and say, hang on, we need to understand this better. We need to pause. We need to figure out differently. What's the best way to do that? Well, if you've got somebody like Greg, who I work with, or like Jim, who I've only met just recently, you could go to them and say, help me calibrate my thinking. Let me tell you what I'm looking at, how I'm looking at this. Take me through a different way of looking at this. Use your experience, your history, your knowledge, your intelligence to educate me into a different way of seeing this so that the conclusion I come to can make a better contribution. A friend of mine I was talking to a guy in a part of England, actually. I think the laddie gives it kind of away. He was talking to this bloke and he said, what is it you can teach me, laddie? What is it you think you can teach me? Well, you can't be taught anything if you've stopped learning. If you've stopped learning, how are you going to continuously improve the work that you're involved in? If you don't continuously improve the work that you're involved in, how are you going to create any sustainable advantage commercially, reputationally, in terms of the procedures, practices, or the management leadership that you give? If you're no longer learning, you're almost certainly a contributor, albeit unwittingly, to risk. Chris Agiris said to me, he said, the problem is, Mike, he said, you're unaware. And what makes it worse is you're unaware you're unaware. So step one, I'll hit you with a brick called this logic. We'll get you aware. When you're aware, we'll teach you. So what is risk? let's take a little bit at root cause. Take the following statements. Drive up shareholder returns to build personal reputation. How many of us do that? Most people I know do that. As we do that, how aware are we of the inherent risks that we create through the practices we use to achieve that? Very few of us are aware of that. And in fact, some of us, and many of you may know people, who have actively inhibited the feedback to that effect. This begins to build a risk profile. You then take the requirement to drive up shareholder returns to managers, and you direct them to take on these projects, cut the time, drive down the costs, increase the volumes, alter the quality, and all the rest of it. What did you do? What did I do as a young, hungry, promotion-oriented manager with a family? Was I said, yes, boss? Thinking, how am I going to figure my way out of this? And as Greg said, I had a strong belief in my engineering, problem-solving ability to sort of problem-solve my way out of trouble. Did I? Well, I problem-solved my way out of trouble by getting promoted to leave the problem behind, which has been said before. So have I been involved in this myself personally? Answer is yes. I know it firsthand. The difficulty then arises that as a young manager, and I direct my attention to how am I going to accomplish this, I find that my predecessors have left me legacies of distressed assets, which I further distress by taking more cost out of them to leave another legacy for the guy who's coming in after me. And underneath that, what do? Do I report that I failed? What was it Jim said? No. How many of us actually edge the truth a little bit? How many people in health, for example, edged the truth a little bit that led to 1,200 premature deaths? How many people edged the truth a little bit that led to payment protection insurance being missold? How many people edged the truth a little bit, which, et cetera, et cetera? And the press is littered with people who are edging the truth a little bit by bit. I want to show you a different way of organizing this information. We call them culture cycles. Why? Because as a sociologist, I'm entitled to a point of view on culture, I feel. It's my area of expertise, and it's been developing over recent years. Why have we chosen cycles? Well, because one of the things that we did in aviation and automotive was to look at cycle time reduction. We wanted to increase the pace. But as we increased the pace at this point in the project or the production process, we also needed to synchronize the next step in the process onto it. As we started to increase the pace, another phenomenon occurred, and that is the need to collaborate with the different skills, the different subject matter experts, the different professional inputs, the different people who had authority on budgets who could stop us. The need to actually synchronize and collaborate increased as we increased the pace. What happens in a lower level of organizational maturity is as you increase the pace, you fragment more into isolated pockets, you separate from each other, and you create workarounds. The interface costs rise. Ultimately, the thing goes into delay. The only way we could find to drive down cycle time was to drive up collaboration, to drive up the interpersonal skills, to drive up the maturity, the developmental maturity of the individuals, to understand how better to use the intelligence and the experience of the people that they were collaborating with, and how in turn to get off their promotion bicycle and hold their knowledge to themselves for their own agendas and share that knowledge with their colleagues as well. Now that's not such an easy thing to do when you're up to your ass in alligators off the coast of Mozambique. This as a particular sort of culture cycle. Drive up shareholder returns to build personal reputation. Direct promotion-oriented managers to cut costs, give them projects, etc. They try and operate their project on the ground where it matters with the rocks, on the basic work, and they further distress distressed assets. They fail to or misreport vital information. One of the things that we do when we go around is take a look at risk registers. We look how they've been filled in, and then we go and look what they didn't fill in. Risk registers always misrepresent. It's important to have access to the actual data. The point of this cycle is to actually code into a very simple representational statement some complex data. And it's really important to understand that when you get in underneath this, you need to have data points. On each one of these little boxes, one of these statements, we can run as many as 127 data points of validity. Issue for us is, We wanted to create a cultural signature, not just to say this is the culture, but this is the culture in that department, in this business, in that part of the business, on that part of the process, in this country, with that jurisdiction, with that government. We wanted to be able to create a signature personality in the same way that you can actually assign a personality to yourselves. Each one of you is distinctly different. The reason we wanted to do that was to create a description rather than an assertion of truth. If this is an adequate description, we should be able to use it. And we created this idea to generate what we call predictive models. Question here is, governance, stakeholder objectives, local impact, drive into there, start to drive this cycle. What do you think the risk potential is of any input that is created there? Well, we told somebody what the risk potential was, and do you know what they said to us? We can't tell him that, he'll fire us. We cannot escalate this to that CEO, he will fire us. We daren't do it. Now, under those circumstances, you can start to get more data points, because to drive up shareholder returns, to build personal reputation, I'm going to inhibit certain classes of feedback to myself. That takes you into a different way of looking at how this culture cycle is going to work. Sorry to canter over this. It's a big subject, as you can probably... Done the same as you, Jim. I'm learning well from you, mate. So when we come to it, what is it we actually do? I'm supposed to keep this to 10 minutes, so I apologize if I run over a bit. What do? Is we take our ideas about culture cycles, we link them to the other systems, the technical, professional, commercial, reputational, governance, government, other cycles exist. The culture cycle is the way in which you accomplish the requirements of those other cycles. So for example, you can have a very tangible managerial cycle of here are the objectives, here are the projects, here are the deliverables, here are the benefits, there's your managerial cycle, and those of you who know about lean production will recognize that as Hoshinkanri. If you stick a culture cycle underneath that, which goes, we're unclear about what these objectives mean, we misunderstand how to work as a team, and these projects are getting blown by our conflicts that are embedded within it. In terms of the deliverables, well, we'll reinterpret the brief in order to say this is what you wanted, and when we come around to the benefits, we'll fudge those so that we'll make this crock of shit a bag of fertilizer. And some of you may have been involved in projects of that kind. Can you predict what the outcome is going to be? So what do? In Petromol? We use sector-savvy people, not to come and criticize, but to come and say, this is where you are in your evolution as a business, in this sector, on these issues, in that jurisdiction. We know there's a cycle, a life cycle of maturing that goes on in each one of them. Just because my daughter cannot ride a bike, and she's 5, doesn't mean to say she's incompetent. Where is she in her stage of development? So with sector-savvy heavyweights in Petromol, we can look at where are you in your maturing? What is it we would expect to see? And then take a look at, you know that Marxian thing about capitalism contains within it the seeds of its own destruction? Well, take Raj's point. Capitalism also contains within it the seeds of its own regeneration. What we can do with the sector heavyweights, with guaranteed confidentiality, is to create a risk audit which looks at the seeds of regeneration. What are the strong things you can build on? What are the things you're really good at? When were you last taken into a performance appraisal as an individual and they sat down and they said, the thing I really like about you is your strategic thinking, your relationship building, your capacity to influence, your technical savvy, the way you share that with people around you, the fact that you build projects and the teams that are in those projects go on to do great things. How many of you have ever been sat down and had that said to you? Well, Mike, you could improve on this. Well, Mike, your commercial now says, I think we ought to send you on an MBA program and you can do all the finance and accounting, etc., etc. I've always been appraised on where people have judged me lacking. I've very rarely been appraised on where people judge me as strong. We take a look at where are you strong. That is the platform for the future. We can build from there. Part of that is board assessment. I worked with the board of PwC about 10 years ago. You might know a chap called Kieran Pointer, who was the then senior partner. And we were working through all this stuff, and I said, well, look, you know, the culture side of this is missing. You're going on all these technical audits and all the rest of it. Why can't we do this? So I participated in developing that. And from those results, I still use it. is we can offer through Petromal a board assessment. Every chairman needs to have his board assessed to identify the continuous personal development, to actually identify the latent risk of the culture that will lead to a risk event, a 100-year event in the next 5 years is what you'd predict off the culture cycle I showed you. Expert advice without saying, sector networking, we all love it. Agents of change. How do you change mindset, attitude, and behavior? We have had to study the neurosciences to get into this, and we had the great good fortune to work with somebody called Baroness Greenfield, who some of you may know. She's the professor of neuropharmacology at Oxford. She gave us 9 out of 10 for the homework, which I was absolutely thrilled with, because she's an amazing person. Build on strengths. Above all, we can't be here as Petromal without being trusted. I couldn't be here, having had the opportunities I've had, without the clients that I have worked with and for trusting me. I have had information that could reduce the share price of a company by up to 50%, and I guess some of you have had too. We need to be capable of being trusted, to know about Chinese walls, to know about good governance. Because we are sector savvy, and Greg's the heavyweight, I'm the lightweight in this, I'm the sociologist after all, we are the ones we offer ourselves as supportive, trusted, competent, and willing to follow you into the problems that you have to address for the coming generation. Because I don't know about you, but my daughters are going to inherit the companies we create, and I'd quite like them to inherit something that's better than I experienced. That's about me, a little bit about the stuff I do, and I hand you over to the next step.
Any questions for Mike?
Oh, questions. I like questions.
We might have some questions. Was that the beginning of how do you manage the culture of a company? And as a chairman or as the CEO or of a senior manager in a company, you need to understand the implications of the questions you ask, how you ask them, how you appraise people, what you encourage. We're going to go from the what I'll call philosophical to the practical. Brian Hepp, who is a friend of mine for many years, is going to talk a little bit about his experience and how he manages his teams, how he makes sure they speak up when there's a risk that's about to turn into a black swan. Brian.
Afternoon. You can tell by my accent that I'm from Surrey. I moved here 15 years ago for 2 years. Worked originally with Greg, and I was fortunate enough to be one of the original managers with Jim's team in Canada. Excuse me. So my background is basically I cut my teeth in Canada. I know how they can do their wells in 15 days. The last 10 or 12 years, I've been over here trying to influence the European market. Excuse me. And I've been able to have quite a bit of success, actually, in the Netherlands, where I fracked 5 wells 2 years ago, and no one's heard of that. And they definitely weren't unconventional. They were just tight wells. Was able to bring on new gas operations facilities, including about 30 kilometers of pipeline, and new refrigeration units in the Netherlands onshore in less than 2 years, by again managing risk and doing what we do best. And most importantly, I think the most difficult thing is working in Russia and working in Egypt. You can be direct and you can actually force your opinions on people. But when you go to places like Germany or Netherlands or Italy, you have to influence, especially when there's country, the influence of the majors, and in particular the NAM in the Netherlands. So in the 5 years, my previous company with Northern, in the 5 years we were there, it took 2 years for the transfer of the licenses because of political documentation had to go. But in the 3 years, by the time we acquired it, we were able to change the onshore application process for any onshore drilling. I was able to get a drilling permit in less than 6 weeks. And I had problems with my partners because they didn't believe my budgets. They didn't believe I could do what I did, that I could do it safely, and that I could do it without any environmental or any political implications. This was due to nothing other than having the right culture. So everything you've heard here today is what I'm a firm believer in. And I believe that we're actually letting down the new the new generation of engineers. Because when we grew up, there was development plans that were set up for all of us. BP spent a lot of money on me and Talisman. I screwed up a lot. And, but they basically used that as a training platform for me. And that is why I am where I am now. That coupled with the fact that they got rid of everyone that was experienced about 10 years later, we had to hire them back as consultants, put us in some pretty difficult situations. But that's basically got us in the oil industry to where it is now, is that the experience is there. How do we draw that out? How do we get this generation to convey what is important to the newbies, okay? And how do they, how do we change a culture? How do we change the philosophy of operations? Because I still believe that we can drill a well in Europe in 12 days. Unfortunately, no one else here does, okay? And it's because of that, you know, the rig moves, the rules and regulations, and I'm so frustrated with the national oil companies or the major service companies here telling me that they can't do things better, not necessarily quicker, but better because of safety reasons, okay? There are a lot of rules and regulations that have to be changed. So to me, it's managing change and influencing the companies. The way I got the fracking was basically, and I'll tell you the secret. The secret is having the right people. I had a board that had no idea what I did, okay? So while, you know, I go back to what Jim said earlier. To me, that was a benefit because they couldn't question me, but I had the integrity and I believe in honesty and I believe in the handshake that I was able to make that change. They couldn't get me to basically be accountable because they knew I was going to be anyways because they didn't understand what I did. Having said that, the reason I left the company 2 years ago is because they couldn't make a decision because they didn't understand what we did. So the value of the company was dropping because they didn't understand it. The way, and this amazes me because the Dutch government, if anyone's ever worked there, is so adamant about following the regulations and they're so strict. And the political implications, having NAM as a partner, we had a net profit interest with NAM. NAM's biggest concern and their biggest exposure was the fact that if I screwed up, it would affect their reputation and would hurt them at the pumps. Okay, that was their biggest exposure. They didn't care about the money I was going to make. They were getting pressure from the government to get rid of their marginal wells. I was their vehicle. We took advantage of that. So I had to deal with the NAM. I had to deal with their public relations group. I had to deal with the local neighbors. I had to get that pipeline permit. Normally takes NAM 5 years to get, 6 years. I had to get it in less than a year to get all the permits, going through some archaeological digs, going underneath rivers, okay, and going through hundreds of landowners. And for me, that was a strategic well, not because of the high risk, but because we only had one asset and the company needed cash flow. So our risk was managed against schedule, but we knew what that risk was. We knew that we were going to lose value on that asset. So my belief is it's culture, it's management by walking around. I was in a field last week. There was a state-owned company that is drilling a well for a company that I'm working with. They had more safety concerns than you can imagine, and I didn't want to be out there. But because of my history, because of my training, I knew what to look for. Does anyone know what a chick sand is? Okay, a chick sand's it's like a swivel joint that they make for quick connections on the rig. So no matter how the rig's laid out, they can set it up. It's outlawed in most countries now because they have a tendency under high pressure of breaking, and when they break, they swing and they whip around and they cause a lot of damage. This rig still had chick sands, but more importantly, there's about a $2 or €2 chain that should be connecting these two chick sands together, so if it ruptures, they had no idea. So how do I influence the guy in the field, great little young engineer, 28, 29 years old, spoke English relatively well. How do I influence him about criticizing the way he runs his operation? And it was easy because I had drilling experience. I got down on my knees. I played around with him a little bit, and I just suggested to him on the side that for safety reasons, if he wants, I can get these chains for him. It'll make a big difference because I've seen people hurt. Okay, once you're relating to him at that level, it's easy because he sees the benefit. He tells his boss is doing it, he gets the credit. I'm happy with that. The big problem is how do you influence the guys in the office? And they're the most difficult because they have different goals. They have different strategies. More importantly, big companies, they have a culture now of being unaccountable. Okay, they distribute the accountability. A lot of it is legal. Okay, it's because if you If one person's accountable, he can be charged. If 5 people are accountable, then only the company can be at risk, okay? So it sort of, am I going too long? Are you okay with this? It creates the safety policy that we used to laugh at was nobody moves, nobody gets hurt. So basically, you got a 5-year program for a big company, and you got 5 years to get around to it, and we'll get around to it when we do, okay? And to me, that is the culture that we have to change. I'm British, okay, so I can be critical of the British system. It upsets me that we aren't managing our resources well. I agree with Jim in terms of the fracking. Again, I'm not that familiar with the geology as much as I should be, but I know there's a whole lot of tight formations that can benefit from it. The trouble is that we have too many people that are scared to make commitments from the government level, even though the deck has come a long way. So I'm passionate about what I do. I believe in change, and I believe it all comes down to culture and management by walking around and basically getting the best people. One last thing, the reason I was successful in the Netherlands is because of Shell. Shell laid off some of their best people in the year 2000. I found those old guys who were unemployed, who were laid off, didn't care how much money they made, but was really upset that they were let go and wanted to prove to their company that they could still do things. And these guys turned the world for me. It took me 2 years to find them, but I got the best landman, and that's what I do when I go into countries. Lastly, the biggest mistake that a lot of Canadian companies are doing now, and I have a company that I'm working with in Germany that fell right into it, is we do different things in Canada and North America than you do here. I was involved in 1982 when the Americans came in and started bringing money into Canada, and were going to show us how to develop our fields and do things right. And I remember upset or pissed off. What were we trying to get? It pissed us off that Americans are coming into our fields and telling us that our equipment wasn't as good as theirs. When I go into Russia now, I integrate. I find the best of what they've got, I integrate it with Canadian. Same thing in the Netherlands. 4 years ago, we drilled with casing. We set the European record, new technology, had to run it past the government, had to run it past our partners. New technology for Europe, 15 years old in Canada, no longer economic, okay? But we made money, we saved money. So I believe that proper risk management, there's false economics. If you can't spend the time on planning and project planning and getting the right people involved, it's false economics because you're gonna be paying 40 million on a blowout, right? So to me, it's getting my manager and my accountants to give me the money to do that planning, to spend the money looking at the risk and financial analysis before I even drill a well. Big companies have trouble with that because they're protective. I drilled a 4,000 meter horizontal well in the Netherlands. I had my drilling on paper exercise was 3 days long, involved everybody involved. We did total risk, financial, safety evaluation. And we had contingencies based on that. I went to a $70 million pseudo-deep well that we were going with a partner. It took a day. And the morning of it, their manager came down and talked about the importance of safety and the importance of doing things right. And then we spent 3/4 of an hour while they told us what they were doing. And it was just checking boxes. So that's who I am. That's what I believe. And I think that us as an industry, we have a responsibility to train the new people. And this mentorship has to start, and has to start now. And that's it. Sounds good? Am I going to chat?